The tension in the room was electric. Every person present felt it, the anticipation of a confrontation, the quiet promise that this day would be remembered not just for the trial, but for the moment when authority collided with authority, and only one would hold. The murmurs grew quieter as everyone sensed the impending confrontation. The gavel, still resting quietly at the judge's side, seemed to hum with possibility, a silent herald of what was about to occur. The officer straightened his posture once more, his jaw tight. He did not yet speak, but the room knew the moment was coming, and the judge, calm, methodical, and unyielding, prepared to demonstrate a truth that no uniform, no badge, and no assumption of power could ever erase. In her courtroom, the law ruled supreme, and no one, no matter how confident, no matter how imposing, was above it. The stage was set. The audience was watching, and the collision of authority was inevitable. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a routine legal proceeding now carried a quiet electricity, the kind that makes every sound, every cough, every shuffle of papers, seem magnified. The officer, seated near the front, could feel the weight of the courtroom on him, yet he refused to yield. His badge, his uniform, the very authority he embodied. He believed it gave him control over this room. He had walked in expecting compliance, and the subtle resistance he now faced only fueled his frustration. At first, his actions were small, almost imperceptible. A sharp glance at a witness who paused too long. A tap of the pen against the table as the defense attorney collected her thoughts. But gradually, the interruptions grew bolder. He spoke over the lawyers, questioning their questions, leaning forward as if the words themselves needed his approval before being allowed to reach the judge. The courtroom, once orderly and predictable, now hummed with tension, every person sensing the growing imbalance. The judge noticed immediately. She had seen this behavior before, officers who mistook rank for influence, who assumed that the mere presence of a badge could bend the process to their will. She watched, unflinching, as he leaned forward, speaking before a witness could answer, issuing directions that were not his to give. He thought the trial's pace was his to control, that the law itself would bend to his impatience. But she remained calm, letting him make his moves while silently preparing to dismantle the illusion of power he had so arrogantly assumed. The spectators in the gallery shifted uneasily in their seats. A low murmur passed through the room, growing louder with each interruption. Some whispered to one another, incredulous at the officer's audacity. Others stared wide-eyed at the judge, sensing the storm brewing between the two figures at the front of the courtroom. The lawyers were visibly frustrated, forced to pause mid-argument, their carefully prepared statements interrupted by the officer's unsolicited commentary. Every word he spoke seemed designed to assert dominance, to remind everyone that he was present, in uniform, and therefore in control. But control, as the judge knew, was an illusion when it was assumed rather than earned. She let the moment stretch, letting the officer's arrogance play out before addressing it. Each interruption, each question posed out of turn, only made his eventual reckoning more satisfying. For the officer, though, there was a growing tension he did not yet recognize. The courtroom had begun to push back, not with words, not yet, but with the quiet weight of expectation, the subtle signals of a room that refused to bow to force. The officer's impatience became increasingly obvious. He shifted in his seat, tapping his boots against the floor. He leaned closer to the witness stand, questioning answers before they were even completed. "Is that really necessary?" he interjected sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Can't we move faster?" The defense attorney, still seated, did not flinch. She kept her gaze steady on him, her voice calm but deliberate when she finally spoke. "This courtroom operates according to its own rules," she said. "Everyone will have their turn. Including you, officer." The murmurs in the courtroom grew, some subtle, some harder to suppress. The spectators sensed the friction building, the invisible tension between assumed power and rightful authority. Even the jury, usually detached observers, seemed on edge, leaning forward as though anticipating a confrontation that was still a step away. The officer straightened, clearly annoyed. He had not expected to be challenged, certainly not with such quiet confidence. His movements became more pronounced, his interruptions sharper. He began questioning procedural details, implying that the trial's slow pace was due to incompetence or hesitation. Each comment was meant to assert dominance, to remind everyone that he was there, in uniform, enforcing order, Or at least that was how he saw it. But with every move, the judge remained calm. She did not scold, did not react. Instead, she allowed him to escalate, letting the courtroom feel the imbalance of power before she intervened. Her fingers moved across her notes, seemingly unconcerned, yet her eyes never left him. There was a quiet strategy at play: let the arrogance show itself fully, and then dismantle it in a single unforgettable moment. The officer's frustration became visible. He leaned over the table, pointing at documents, questioning witnesses before they were finished, making comments that were clearly intended to assert authority. But in doing so, he only drew more attention to himself, and more importantly, to the fact that he had crossed boundaries he had no right to cross. The courtroom's focus shifted, not just to the trial, but to the escalating tension between the man in uniform and the woman presiding over it. A subtle hush settled. Even the murmurs of spectators faded as the moment stretched. The officers around him, colleagues who had accompanied him, glanced nervously at one another. Some shifted in their seats, sensing that the line had been crossed, that the man in their midst had overstepped in a way that would not go unchallenged. Then came a pause. The officer, realizing that no one was immediately responding to his interruptions, leaned back slightly, as though questioning the lack of compliance. His jaw tightened, a faint flicker of doubt crossing his face. For a fleeting moment, he may have recognized that authority in this room was not dictated by a badge or uniform, but by something far deeper, by the law itself, and by the person charged with enforcing it impartially. Yet he refused to yield. He continued, trying to assert control, his voice rising ever so slightly, demanding attention and obedience. "We need to proceed efficiently," he said. "The trial cannot be delayed further." The judge finally looked up from her notes, her gaze locking onto him with precision. It was calm, unwavering, and impossibly sharp. Every person in the courtroom felt the shift, a quiet yet undeniable tension that signaled the impending confrontation. The officer had assumed his authority was absolute, but in her eyes, he saw the first hint of challenge. Not anger, not theatrics, just authority, absolute and unyielding. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone could sense it, the friction, the clash of assumed power against rightful authority. The murmurs of spectators, the subtle movements of lawyers, even the stillness of the jury, all contributed to a moment that was building, inch by inch, toward a collision that could not be avoided. The officer straightened once more, clearly bracing himself, confident that he could still assert control. But deep down, a faint unease had taken root. He had pushed, tested boundaries, and disrupted the flow of justice, believing his uniform gave him that right. Yet the room, the trial, and most importantly the judge, were about to prove him wrong. The courtroom held its collective breath. The moment had arrived where arrogance would meet impartial authority, and only one would emerge in control. The stage was set, the tension taut like a drawn bowstring, and everyone present knew something was about to happen that would be remembered long after the trial ended. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Every whisper, every shuffle of papers, every quiet breath of the spectators seemed magnified in the oppressive silence that filled the room. The officer, now visibly frustrated, leaned forward once more, certain that he could assert control. He believed his badge gave him authority beyond the law, that his uniform allowed him to bend the courtroom to his will. But he had underestimated one thing: the judge. She had watched his every move, noting his impatience, his interruptions, his sharp, commanding tone that sought to dominate the proceedings. And now, she was ready. Her eyes lifted from her notes, calm, precise, and piercing. There was no anger in her gaze, no theatrics, only the unwavering certainty of someone who knew the power of the law, and how to wield it when necessary. The officer straightened, unaware of the full weight of the moment. He had tested the boundaries of the court, believing himself untouchable, but the judge's quiet authority was about to demonstrate that his assumptions were gravely mistaken. "Officer," she began, her voice cutting through the room with a calm authority that demanded attention. "This is a court of law. Every person in this room is bound by its rules. No one is above the court, not even those sworn to uphold it." The words hit like a gavel themselves. The officer froze, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. For the first time, he realized that his attempts to control the courtroom had not only failed, they had been inappropriate and, in the eyes of the law, unacceptable. The spectators leaned forward. The jurors, lawyers, and even the reporters felt the gravity of the moment. There was a collective understanding. The courtroom was no longer just a place of trial, but a stage on which authority itself was being measured, tested, and corrected. Courtroom decorum is not optional, the judge continued, her gaze unwavering. Authority here is earned through respect for the law, not through intimidation or force. Step back and allow the proceedings to continue without disruption. The officer slowly straightened, his shoulders tightening, his jaw firm. He stepped back, a mix of humiliation and reluctant respect washing over him. The murmurs in the room softened, replaced by a heavy, almost reverent silence. The lesson had been made clear: a badge does not confer absolute power. Respect must be earned through adherence to the law, not assumed by rank or position. The judge's words were not just a reprimand, they were a demonstration of the law's impartial authority. Every person in the room understood that moment would be remembered far longer than the trial itself. The officer's presence, once imposing, had been neutralized by the undeniable weight of her authority. Even the lawyers, previously flustered by his interruptions, allowed themselves a small, subtle nod of relief. The trial could now proceed as it was meant to, with the rules of the court restored. The young defense attorney, whose calm demeanor had frustrated him earlier, looked on with a quiet sense of vindication. She had understood from the start that authority in this room belonged not to the uniform, but to the law itself. Outside the courtroom, the story would spread quickly. Witnesses, spectators, and even members of the press would recall the moment when a single judge reminded everyone that no one, no matter their rank or badge, could bypass the law. It was a lesson in humility, in the limits of power, and in the unassailable authority of justice. The officer, now seated quietly, no longer attempted to dominate the proceedings. His posture had shifted from assertive to attentive, a silent acknowledgement that his previous actions had been misguided. The judge returned to her papers, methodical, precise, and unwavering. The gavel rested at her side, a quiet symbol of the law's ultimate authority. Every participant in the courtroom felt the shift. The tension that had built over the past hours dissipated slowly, leaving a profound respect in its place. The trial continued, but the lesson had already been delivered. Authority is not a right granted by uniform or title. It is a responsibility earned through respect, adherence to the law, and understanding one's limits. The officer glanced around the room, noting the expressions of spectators, lawyers, and jurors alike. He may have realized, in that quiet moment of reflection, that his assumptions of power had been naive. His badge, his rank, his uniform, none of it could substitute for the integrity and authority that the judge wielded with calm precision. It was not a humiliation born of anger or scolding, but of undeniable truth. In that courtroom, the scales of justice had been restored, and the lesson delivered in a way that would be remembered by all who witnessed it. The collision of authority had ended, with the law, not the badge, prevailing. The courtroom, once tense and fraught with anticipation, slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Lawyers resumed their arguments, witnesses gave their testimony, and the jurors listened intently, their attention sharpened by the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. The officer, now subdued, followed the proceedings with a new awareness of his place within the courtroom. He had learned, in real time, the difference between assumed power and rightful authority. For the spectators, the lesson was equally clear. They had witnessed more than a legal trial. They had witnessed a confrontation that underscored the impartiality of the law. Authority, when misused or assumed, would always be held accountable, and the courtroom had proven it without drama or spectacle, relying only on clarity, precision, and unwavering adherence to justice. As the day wore on, the echoes of that confrontation lingered. Conversations in the hallway, whispers among reporters, and reflections among the jurors all returned to the moment when a single judge had reminded a man in uniform, and everyone present, that the law is supreme. It is impartial, and it spares no one who assumes they can bend it to their will. By the time the trial concluded for the day, calm had fully returned. The courtroom had seen a lesson in humility, respect, and the proper exercise of authority. The officer, now fully aware of the limits of his power, sat quietly, absorbing the reality that his badge did not grant him control over the law or the courtroom. The judge continued her work with unwavering focus, her presence a reminder that authority is earned through wisdom, fairness, and an understanding of one's role within the justice system. The trial would continue, but the confrontation had already left a lasting impression on everyone present. That day, The courtroom had witnessed more than a legal proceeding. It had witnessed the quiet triumph of justice over arrogance, of impartial authority over assumed power. The lesson was simple but unforgettable. No matter the uniform, no matter the rank, no one stands above the law when justice is present. And for the officer, that truth had been made painfully, undeniably clear. He walked into the courtroom thinking his badge made him untouchable. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that suggested authority, a rhythm that demanded attention, whether the room wanted to give it or not. Every eye turned as he entered. The jurors, the lawyers, even a few spectators who had come merely to observe the trial. Tension filled the air like static electricity, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise. Something about the way he carried himself suggested that he believed he could bend the proceedings to his will, simply because he wore a uniform. It was a high-profile trial, the kind that drew attention from the local media and legal enthusiasts alike. The charges were serious, the stakes enormous, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras angled to catch every twitch of a witness's eye. Lawyers adjusted their ties, straightened their skirts, and tried to maintain focus, knowing that a single misstep could unravel their cases. The jurors, chosen for their impartiality, were already alert, sensing that today's events would not follow the usual procedural calm of a courtroom. The officer moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He glanced at the judge seated behind the bench, her expression calm, almost unreadable. She was a woman known for her exacting standards, her reputation for fairness matched only by her refusal to tolerate nonsense. But for a moment, he seemed to size her up, as though he could challenge her authority without consequence. That was the kind of man who walked into a courtroom convinced that a badge gave him a license to command, a license that was about to be tested. As he took his place near the front, his presence was impossible to ignore. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the unmistakable aura of law enforcement. Yet there was a subtle tension in his posture, a barely perceptible twitch in his jaw, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. It was as if he knew he held power, but feared the circumstances might not fully recognize it. He scanned the room, his gaze pausing on the defense attorney, a young woman who met his stare without flinching. The audacity of her calm stare seemed to annoy him, yet he didn't back down. The judge, meanwhile, flipped through her notes with meticulous precision, her fingers moving over the pages like a pianist running scales. She glanced up briefly, noting the officer's posture, the way he projected authority even where it wasn't his to project. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in assessment. She had seen many officers in her time, men and women who mistook rank for influence, who thought their uniforms allowed them to command obedience where the law demanded compliance. She knew that moments like this required patience and strategy, not confrontation. The tension was palpable. Every whisper in the courtroom seemed louder than it should have been. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, felt amplified. The officer adjusted his belt, brushing against the sidearm that hung there as a reminder of the authority he wielded. He tapped a finger against the table, a subtle but deliberate display of impatience. He was sending a message, even if he didn't speak a word yet. The proceedings needed to move faster, needed to obey the pace he set. And then he did speak. Not loudly, not yet, but in a tone that suggested both command and expectation. A lawyer paused mid-sentence, sensing the interruption that was coming, though none in the courtroom could yet anticipate the full weight of it. The officer's voice cut through the quiet, carrying over the murmurs of the spectators and the scratch of pens on paper. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement, a challenge. "Are we going to get on with this?" he said, each word clipped, sharp. "Or do we continue to waste time?" The courtroom fell silent, the suddenness of the comment arresting attention. All eyes turned toward him again. The judge's gaze lifted, calm but piercing, measuring the situation, analyzing the officer's intent. She did not respond immediately. Her silence was deliberate, a calculated pause that allowed the weight of the courtroom to settle on the man who believed he could control it. The young defense attorney stared at him, unflinching, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. She didn't move, didn't respond. The balance of tension shifted ever so slightly, a quiet but noticeable tug-of-war between arrogance and authority. The officer's shoulders stiffened. He clearly expected a retort, an acknowledgment of his authority, some concession that the pace of the trial should bend to him. But the judge did not move. She was the eye in the storm, unshaken by bluster, unafraid of confrontation. Her fingers continued to move over her notes, methodical, precise, deliberate. And in that quiet, calculated motion, she sent a message. This courtroom operates under its own rules, and no badge grants immunity from them. A slight murmur rose from the back benches. Spectators leaned forward, sensing that something important was unfolding. Some exchanged glances, whispering softly to one another. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room, consciously or not, understood that this was not an ordinary trial. This was a trial of authority itself. The officer shifted his weight, a subtle motion but one loaded with meaning. He believed himself the enforcer, the one who could bend the situation to his will. Yet the air in the courtroom had already begun to change. He felt it, though he might not have admitted it even to himself. The judge was not intimidated. His presence, while imposing, had not achieved the dominance he had assumed it would. He had entered expecting submission, but the court was not a place for assumptions. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his confidence appeared. The judge's eyes met his, not with anger, not with scorn, but with an unflinching certainty that spoke louder than any words could. She knew the power of the law, and she knew how to assert it without raising her voice, without theatrics, without drama. All it took was her gaze, steady and unwavering, and suddenly the illusion of the officer's dominance began to fade. He had walked in thinking the badge made him untouchable. Every eye had turned to him, yes, but not in submission. In that courtroom, authority would be tested, but not in the way he had imagined. He was about to learn, in real time, a lesson that many officers only understand after much reflection, that the law is impartial, the court is sovereign, and respect must be earned, not assumed.